Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Universe. Tonight we are not going to talk about anything urgent or anything loud, or anything that needs your attention in the way the world usually demands it. Instead, we are going to walk together into a single long night beside the Nile, more than 3,000 years ago, somewhere along that narrow green ribbon of life stretching through the desert. And we are simply going to let that night unfold around us slowly, the way real nights do. The sun will lower itself behind the western hills, the direction the old Egyptians always associated with the land of the dead and with rest. The river will turn from gold to rose to a deep, quiet blue. Reed boats will settle against muddy banks. Lamps will be lit, one by one, in a small village of workers and in the shadowed halls of a great stone temple. Somewhere a scribe will still be writing by a small steady flame, and somewhere else a whole household will simply be going to sleep on the roof, where the air stays cooler. There is nothing to solve here, and nothing to remember. Just one long night beside the Nile, 100 gentle facts, and my voice beside you as you drift slowly, all the way down into sleep. Picture, if you will, the sun beginning its unhurried descent over the western desert, the direction the ancient Egyptians called the land of the dead, a place where the sun itself seemed to travel each evening before beginning its long, hidden journey back toward morning. The Nile below catches the last of the light in long, slow ripples, its surface shifting from bright gold to a deep, warm amber as the heat of the day finally begins to loosen its hold on the valley. This particular evening belongs to no single year, but borrows gently from the long, layered span of ancient Egyptian history, a civilization that lasted, in one form or another, for well over 3,000 years. Far longer than most civilizations manage even once. Tonight we are simply visitors, drifting like a soft evening wind along one composite, imagined night beside this ancient river, so that we might feel its particular hush without needing to sort the centuries or the dynasties too carefully. What matters is only this, that the sun is going down now, gently, the way it always has, over a narrow green valley cradled by endless sand, settling as we are into rest. There is a quiet, settled comfort in resting for a moment with this thought before we move gently onward. The Nile itself was, in the truest sense, the whole reason Egypt could exist at all. A single long river flowing north through hundreds of miles of otherwise unforgiving desert, carrying with it the water and the rich black silt that made farming possible in an almost rainless land. The ancient Egyptians called their own country Kemet, meaning the Black Land, in direct reference to this dark, fertile soil left behind each year by the river, drawing a clear and constant distinction from Deseret, the red land of barren desert stretching away on either side. Nearly the entire population lived within a few miles of this single waterway, so that a journey along its length was, in a very real sense, a journey through the whole of Egyptian life, past farms and villages and temples, all drawing their existence from the same patient, generous current. Tonight, as the light fades over the water, that same old boundary still holds, green fields giving way abruptly to gold sand at the valley's edge, a clean, quiet line between two entirely different worlds only a short walk apart. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. Small reed boats built from bundles of papyrus lashed tightly together still rest along the riverbank as the light fades, their light frames well suited to the calm, gentle waters of the Nile itself rather than to any rougher open sea. These slender boats had been used for fishing, for short trips between villages, and for simple pleasure since the earliest periods of Egyptian history, appearing already in tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom, propelled by a single paddle or a small sail when the wind agreed to help. Larger wooden ships, built from imported cedar and other sturdy timber since Egypt itself had little suitable wood of its own, carried heavier cargo and grander passengers along the same water, their painted hulls and carved prows a common sight on any given day. As dusk settles now, most of these boats sit still and quiet, tied loosely to wooden posts, gently rocking with the slow current, ready to be untied again at first light, waiting patiently through the dark the way any tired vessel does after a long day spent moving steadily along the river's calm, unhurried surface. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. As the sun continues its slow fall toward the horizon, it draws close to disappearing behind the same western cliffs that the ancient Egyptians associated so strongly with death and burial, since nearly every tomb and pyramid in Egypt was built on the western bank of the Nile, facing the setting sun rather than the rising one. This was no accident of geography, but a deliberate, careful choice, born from watching the sun vanish each evening into the west, and imagining that it must be entering, somewhere beyond sight, into the realm of the dead before beginning its hidden nighttime journey back toward the east. The eastern bank, by contrast, generally held the villages and cities of the living, the markets and homes and busy daily routines of ordinary people going about their lives. Tonight, this same old pattern holds quietly true, the golden light retreating steadily toward that same western horizon, carrying with it, as it always has, the gentle and very old idea that even the sun itself needed to rest before returning, faithfully, the following morning. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. The god most closely tied to this setting sun was Ra, one of the oldest and most important deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon, understood by the ancient Egyptians as sailing across the sky each day in a great solar bark, a divine boat carrying his light steadily from horizon to horizon. As evening falls, Ra was believed to complete this daily crossing and prepare to enter the underworld itself, beginning a long and genuinely perilous nighttime voyage that we will follow more closely later in our own long night together. Ra's importance touched nearly every part of Egyptian religious life, merging over the centuries with other gods such as Amun to form combined deities like Amun-Ra, reflecting a flexible, layered kind of religious thinking that allowed different gods to blend and shift depending on region and era. Tonight, as the last edge of the sun slips below the western hills, know that this same quiet moment, watched patiently by countless generations before us, once carried the calm and confident belief that the sun's journey was never truly ending, only continuing unseen through the patient dark ahead. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. The colors spreading now across the sky deserve a slow moment of their own, since sunsets over the Nile Valley have long been shaped by fine dust carried on the wind from the surrounding desert, catching the low, slanting light in wide bands of orange, rose, and a deep, settling violet. The flat, open geography of the valley, with its wide sky uninterrupted by any tall hills close at hand, allowed these colors to spread generously from one horizon to the other, painting both the sky itself and the still surface of the river below in matching, mirrored tones. Palm trees standing along the bank turned to soft black silhouettes against this glow, their long fronds barely stirring in the gentle, cooling evening air, while somewhere nearby, the mud brick walls of a village catch the last warm light before fading into shadow themselves. There is no rush to any of this, the way there never has been, the whole enormous sky settling, breath by breath, into the calm and steady dark of night, exactly as patiently as it always has above this same ancient river. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. As true darkness begins to gather, the temperature of the valley drops noticeably from the fierce heat of the day, since the same dry desert air that allowed such powerful daytime heat also allowed that heat to escape quickly once the sun was gone, leaving evenings and nights considerably cooler than the hours just before them. Many households took gentle advantage of this cooling, moving up onto the flat mud brick roofs of their homes as the evening advanced, where a small breeze often moved more freely than it did down in the narrow, shaded streets below. Sleeping on the roof beneath the open sky, on a simple woven mat or a light frame bed, was a common and comfortable choice during the warmer months, offering both cooler air and a clear view of the stars gathering slowly overhead. Tonight, in our own gentle imagined evening, picture just such a rooftop, a family settling down together as the valley cools around them, the last murmur of daytime voices fading slowly into the wider, patient hush of the coming dark. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Beyond the narrow strip of green farmland, the desert itself begins to cool as well, though far more dramatically than the valley, since sand holds almost none of the day's heat once the sun has gone, letting temperatures fall quickly after dusk in a way the more humid, cultivated land along the river does not. Caravans and travelers crossing these drier stretches often preferred to move during the cooler hours of early morning or evening, resting through the hottest part of the day whenever they safely could, a sensible rhythm shaped entirely by the desert's own extreme and unforgiving temperament. Tonight, somewhere out past the fields and the last scattered palm trees, that same dry chill is settling over open sand, a landscape almost entirely empty of sound, holding within it only the occasional distant call of a nightjar or the soft, dry whisper of wind moving across a low dune. It is a landscape of true and total contrast to the fertile valley beside it, one green and gently populated, the other vast, quiet, and starkly, patiently empty. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. Along the riverbank itself, the sounds of evening settle into their own familiar and long-established pattern. Frogs beginning to call from the shallows, water birds settling into reed beds for the night, and somewhere nearby the low, steady murmur of the current moving patiently along its ancient course. Herons and ibises, both closely associated with Egyptian religious imagery, particularly the ibis linked to the god Thoth, would have stood motionless in the shallows at this hour, waiting with enormous, practiced patience for a careless fish to pass within reach. Crocodiles, too, moved along these same waters, generally more active during the cooler hours around dusk and dawn, drifting quietly near the surface before submerging almost entirely from view, respected and even worshipped in certain regions through the crocodile god Sobek. Tonight, this same soft chorus of frog call and settling bird and quiet moving water rises gently from the darkened bank, an old and steady kind of evening music that has accompanied the Nile for as long as anyone standing beside it could ever remember. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. So here we are then at the true beginning of our long night's journey, the sun fully down now behind the western cliffs, the sky deepened into its softest blue-black, the whole valley cooling by slow degrees while its countless creatures and countless people shift, one by one, into the different rhythms of evening. Some will settle onto their rooftops and grow still until morning. Others, a small village of skilled workers not far from here, are only now beginning their own particular evening routine, one we will step into properly in the chapter ahead. And all of it, the wide river and the darkening desert, the settling birds and the waiting crocodiles, belongs to this one unhurried night that we are simply going to drift through together, chapter by chapter, fact by gentle fact, letting the shape of this ancient valley settle slowly over your own tired mind the way darkness settles, always so very gently over the land. Let this whole scene rest now, sky and river and quiet, waiting desert, before we step further into the deeper dark that follows. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Not far from the western cliffs, tucked into a small dry valley hidden from the main riverbank, sits a walled village of modest mud brick homes, a real and carefully studied place that modern archaeologists know as Deir el Medina, though its own residents called it simply Set Mat, the place of truth. This was no ordinary village, for it housed the specialized workers, artists, and craftsmen responsible for carving and decorating the royal tombs hidden in the nearby Valley of the Kings, a community set slightly apart from ordinary farming life because of the secretive, skilled, and sacred nature of its particular work. As evening settles over its narrow streets, doors are closing, small cooking fires are dying down to embers, and families are gathering in the mud brick rooms that have sheltered them for generations, since positions in this village were very often passed down from father to son across many decades. Tonight, we are going to rest for a while inside this same quiet, well-documented community, letting its very real, very human evening settle gently around us. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. The houses of this village stood close together along a single narrow main street, each one built long and narrow behind a shared front wall, typically holding a small entrance room, a main living space, 1 or 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen open to the sky at the back where cooking smoke could safely escape. Walls were built from mud brick, a simple and effective material made from Nile mud mixed with straw and dried thoroughly in the powerful Egyptian sun, then often finished with a coat of plaster, and sometimes painted in simple, cheerful colors near doorways and household shrines. Furniture inside these homes was modest but functional, low stools, simple wooden chests for storing linen and small possessions, and sleeping mats or low beds strung with cord, since even skilled and reasonably comfortable workers lived without the luxury enjoyed by nobility elsewhere in Egypt. Tonight, behind each of these quiet doors, a small household is settling in exactly this same simple, familiar way. Mats unrolled, small lamps lit, the low murmur of a family's evening conversation drifting softly into the cooling night air outside. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. The workers of this village were skilled craftsmen employed directly by the state, and remarkably detailed records survive showing that they were paid not in coin, since Egypt did not yet use minted money in this period, but in fixed rations of grain, delivered on a regular schedule along with supplementary goods such as fish, vegetables, beer, and occasionally cloth or other useful items. These grain rations formed the backbone of the local economy, since surplus grain could be traded among neighbors for other goods or services, effectively functioning as a kind of currency within the village and the surrounding region. Payments were meant to arrive punctually, and the workers kept remarkably careful track of exactly what they were owed and when, a level of record keeping we will look at more closely in a later chapter devoted entirely to the scribes who managed it. Tonight, a full storeroom or an empty one shaped the mood of a household as surely as any other single factor, security resting quite literally on whether the month's grain had arrived as promised. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. One especially well-documented event from this village's long history involves what many historians consider the earliest recorded labor strike in human history, occurring during the reign of Rameses III, when payments of grain were delayed and the workers, rather than simply enduring the shortage quietly, organized themselves and stopped their work entirely, marching to nearby temples to make their grievance known to local officials. Scribes recorded these events on fragments of pottery and limestone called ostraka, describing how the workers stated plainly that they had come because of hunger and thirst, having no clothes, no ointment, no fish, no vegetables, a direct and remarkably human complaint preserved almost exactly as spoken across more than 3,000 years. Eventually, through a mix of partial payment and negotiation with local authorities, the dispute was resolved and work resumed, offering us a rare, intimate glimpse into the real concerns of real working people rather than the grander, more distant concerns of kings and priests. Tonight, in the quiet of this same settled village, that old memory of collective, reasonable protest rests alongside everything else this community has carefully preserved. Nothing more needs to be added to this thought tonight, only the quiet permission to let it rest. Family life inside the village followed patterns that would feel, in many respects, remarkably familiar to us even now. Parents and children sharing modest homes, extended relatives often living nearby, and a strong sense of community reinforced by shared festivals, shared water sources, and generations of near-constant close contact within the village's compact walls. Marriage in ancient Egypt was generally a fairly simple and practical arrangement, formalized mainly through moving in together and mutual agreement rather than any elaborate religious ceremony. And both husbands and wives held recognized legal rights, including the ability to own property and, if necessary, to initiate a divorce. Women in this particular village, and in Egyptian society more broadly, managed households, engaged in trade, and sometimes worked as musicians, weavers, or in other skilled roles, their daily lives woven tightly into the practical rhythm of village life. Tonight, in the soft lamplight behind these mud brick walls, ordinary families are simply settling in for the evening together, sharing a meal, exchanging quiet words, the same unremarkable, comforting rhythm familiar to households across nearly every age of human history. This, too, belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Children in this village began learning skills early, sometimes accompanying fathers to the tomb sites to observe and gradually assist with simple tasks, while others attended informal schooling meant to teach reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, skills highly valued in a community built entirely around precise, careful craftsmanship. Surviving practice exercises, written by young students on flakes of limestone, show rows of repeated signs and short moral texts meant to be copied out again and again. The same patient, repetitive method of learning found in classrooms across many later civilizations as well. Education here was not universal across all of Egypt, remaining a privilege concentrated mainly among families connected to scribble or skilled craft work. Yet within this particular village, literacy rates appear to have been unusually high compared to ordinary farming communities elsewhere along the Nile. Tonight, tucked away in a quiet corner of one home, a stack of practice ostraka sits waiting for tomorrow's lesson, a small, patient testament to a community that valued careful, steady learning as much as careful, steady craftsmanship. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Food in this village drew heavily on the produce of the wider Nile Valley. Bread formed the true staple of every meal, baked daily from emmer wheat ground laboriously by hand between stone querns. Its texture often gritty from small fragments of stone that, over a lifetime, wore down teeth in ways that skeletal remains from this period still clearly show. Beer, brewed from fermented bread and grain, served as both a nutritious daily drink and an important part of the ration system, consumed by adults and children alike in a form considerably less alcoholic than modern beer. Onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, and dates rounded out a diet that, while simple, was reasonably varied and nutritious by the standards of the ancient world, occasionally supplemented with fish from the Nile or meat on more special occasions. Tonight, the last traces of the evening meal are being cleared away in kitchen after kitchen, the mingled scent of baked bread and simple cooked vegetables lingering pleasantly in the cooling night air long after the fires themselves have quieted to embers. There is a plain, steady comfort in facts this small and this certain, offered gently, one at a time. Beyond their working hours, villagers here maintained a genuinely rich social and religious life, worshipping household gods such as Bes, a cheerful, protective dwarf god associated with the home, childbirth, and guarding against evil, alongside Taweret, a fierce yet protective goddess in the shape of a hippopotamus who watched particularly over pregnant women and young children. Small shrines and figurines of these household deities have been found throughout the village's homes, suggesting that religious practice here was woven into daily domestic life rather than confined solely to grand temples elsewhere. Festivals, too, offered welcome breaks from ordinary routine, days set aside for feasting, music, and rest, often tied to the broader religious calendar we will return to later when we speak of the stars and the passing of Egyptian time. Tonight, a small carved figure of Bes sits quietly on a shelf in more than one home nearby, a familiar, comforting presence standing gentle watch over each sleeping household through the settling dark. Let your mind rest on this a little longer, unhurried, before we turn softly toward what comes next. Health and medicine also played a real part in daily village life, and surviving medical papyri from ancient Egypt describe a wide range of treatments, some remarkably practical, involving herbal remedies, wound care, and even basic surgical procedures. Others more clearly rooted in religious ritual and the recitation of protective spells alongside physical treatment. Villagers here had access to physicians, and the community even appears to have included recognized medical practitioners of its own, along with a strong tradition of consulting oracles or local wise women for guidance on matters of health, family, and daily concern. Amulets, small protective charms often shaped like specific gods or sacred symbols, were worn by adults and children alike, believed to offer real protection against illness, misfortune, and the ever-present uncertainty of daily life in the ancient world. Tonight, more than one sleeping child in this village rests with such a small protective charm tied gently at wrist or neck, a quiet, tangible expression of a very old and very human hope for safety through the night ahead. It is, in its own quiet way, one more small thread woven gently into this long night's patient fabric. As this chapter draws softly to its close, let the whole settled shape of this small village rest in your mind now. Narrow streets grown quiet, mud brick homes holding their families close, grain stores standing watch over each household's simple security, and small protective gods keeping their own gentle, silent vigil from modest household shrines. This was a real and remarkably well-documented community, its records preserved in extraordinary detail thanks to the dry desert climate and the villagers' own careful habits of writing nearly everything down, from grain deliveries to family disputes to simple daily complaints. There is a particular comfort in resting, even briefly, inside a place this thoroughly and humanly documented, a village of ordinary skilled people going about ordinary evenings very much like this one, long ago, and yet somehow still remarkably close at hand. Carry this settled village forward with you now, its quiet streets and murmuring households, as we turn our attention next toward the small flickering lamps already being lit inside the great stone temple nearby. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. Rising above the village and the surrounding fields, the great stone temple stands dark and enormous against the deepening sky, its towering entrance pylons and long stone courtyards now catching only the very last, faintest trace of daylight before true night settles fully over its ancient walls. Egyptian temples were built not primarily as gathering places for ordinary worshippers, the way many later religious buildings would be, but as the sacred household of a particular god, a place where that deity was believed to actually reside, fed, clothed, and cared for daily by a dedicated staff of priests. As evening arrives, small points of warm light begin appearing one by one deep within this vast stone structure. Oil lamps being carried carefully through dim hallways by priests continuing the same unhurried rituals that have shaped each evening here for generations beyond counting. Tonight we step gently through these same great stone gateways, following those small moving lights inward, toward the quiet, sacred hush waiting at the temple's very heart. There is a quiet, settled comfort in resting for a moment with this thought before we move gently onward. These small lamps themselves were simple in construction, usually a shallow bowl of pottery or stone holding oil, most commonly pressed from castor beans or sesame, with a twisted wick of linen fiber floating at its center, producing a soft, warm, and fairly smoky light quite different from the bright electric glow many of us know today. A single such lamp could burn steadily for several hours on a modest amount of oil, enough to see clearly by within a small radius, though never bright enough to banish the deeper shadows gathered in the far corners of a large stone hall. Priests moving through the temple after dark carried these lamps carefully from room to room, their flames guarded against any stray draft, casting long, shifting shadows across carved reliefs and painted columns that seemed, in this flickering light, to hold a particular kind of quiet movement of their own. Tonight, picture just such a small flame now, cupped gently in careful hands, moving slowly and steadily deeper into the sacred dark ahead of it. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. The layout of a typical Egyptian temple followed a fairly consistent pattern. A tall, imposing entrance pylon leading into an open courtyard accessible to a somewhat wider range of people, followed by a covered hypo-style hall crowded with massive stone columns, and finally, at the very back, a small, dark, and deeply restricted sanctuary holding the god's own sacred statue. Each successive space grew smaller, darker, and more restricted than the one before it, a deliberate architectural progression meant to mirror a journey from the ordinary daylight world toward the hidden, sacred presence of the divine itself. Only the highest-ranking priests, and on certain occasions the pharaoh himself, were permitted to enter this innermost sanctuary at all, approaching the god's statue with the same careful reverence one might show an honored and genuinely present guest. Tonight, that same careful architectural hush deepens room by room as our own imagined lamp moves further inward, the wide, open courtyard giving way to narrower, darker, more sacred space with every careful step. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. At the very heart of the temple stood the naos, a small stone shrine housing the god's cult statue, usually a relatively modest figure carved from wood or stone and often adorned with gold, its true size far smaller than the towering images of gods carved elsewhere across temple walls and columns. This statue was cared for daily according to a fixed and carefully repeated ritual. Priests approaching in the early morning to wash, dress, and symbolically feed the image with offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense, treating the god quite literally as a living resident requiring daily attention and respect. In the evening hours, a final round of offerings and closing rituals would be performed before the shrine doors were carefully sealed for the night, the god's presence left to rest, in a sense, until the whole careful cycle began again with the following dawn. Tonight, somewhere deep within this darkened sanctuary, those same doors have just been gently closed, sealing in a quiet, sacred stillness that will hold steady until morning light returns. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Incense played an important part in these evening rituals, particularly frankincense and myrrh, both imported at real expense from distant regions including Punt, a trading partner whose exact location remains debated among scholars but which lay somewhere along the Red Sea coast or the Horn of Africa. Burned in small dishes or specially designed censers, this incense filled temple hallways with a thick, sweet, resinous smoke believed to purify the air and please the gods. Its fragrance considered so significant that certain temple reliefs describe it poetically as the sweat, or the very fragrance of the divine itself. The particular scent of frankincense smoke drifting slowly through torchlit stone corridors would have marked, for anyone standing within these walls, an unmistakable signal that sacred ritual was actively underway somewhere nearby. Tonight, that same faint, sweet haze still lingers in the temple's inner rooms, clinging softly to stone and column alike, the last fragrant trace of an offering already completed for another quiet evening. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. The priesthood itself was organized with real care, most temple priests serving not as a full-time permanent occupation, but on a rotating schedule, commonly 1 month of active temple service followed by several months returning to ordinary daily life. A system that allowed a fairly large pool of trained individuals to share the considerable responsibility of maintaining these vast religious institutions. Higher-ranking priests held specific important roles, such as overseeing temple finances, managing the substantial farmland and other property owned by major temples, or leading particular rituals reserved only for the most senior and trusted staff. Purity requirements for priests on active duty were notably strict, including regular bathing, shaved heads and bodies, and specific dietary restrictions, all meant to maintain the ritual cleanliness considered necessary for approaching the sacred spaces we have been quietly walking through tonight. Even now, somewhere within this temple's outer chambers, a handful of priests on this month's rotation are settling in for their own night's rest, their duties for the day already carefully, quietly completed. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. Temples also functioned as major economic institutions in their own right, owning enormous tracts of farmland, herds of cattle, and workshops producing textiles, beer, and other goods, their combined wealth in some periods rivaling that of the royal palace itself. Grain and other resources produced on temple land supported not only the priesthood, but also craftsmen, laborers, and even entire villages, including, in certain periods, communities much like the one we visited a little earlier in our journey tonight. This considerable economic power meant that temples served simultaneously as centers of religious devotion, storage and distribution hubs, and significant local employers, their influence extending well beyond the strictly spiritual matters we might associate with them today. Tonight, somewhere within storerooms attached to this same temple complex, careful stacks of grain and other goods sit quietly in the dark, resources that will, come morning, continue supporting an entire interconnected web of workers and dependents stretching well beyond these sacred stone walls. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Festivals brought this temple to its most vivid and crowded life, particularly grand celebrations such as the Opet festival at Thebes, during which the sacred statue of the god Ammon was carried in procession from one temple to another aboard a beautifully decorated ceremonial boat, accompanied by music, dancing, and enormous crowds of ordinary people who rarely otherwise glimpsed such sacred images directly. These processions, often lasting many days, offered ordinary Egyptians a genuinely rare and treasured opportunity to feel close to their gods, watching gilded shrines pass by amid clouds of incense smoke and the steady rhythm of temple musicians. Such festivals were scheduled according to the same careful calendar of stars and seasons that governed farming and flooding, a topic we will return to more fully in a later chapter devoted to the Nile's own patient rhythm. Tonight, the great temple stands quiet and empty of any such crowd, resting between festivals in exactly the kind of calm, unhurried stillness that makes the space feel, if anything, even larger and more solemn than it does during its most crowded celebrations. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. Music itself held a respected and genuinely important place within temple life, with certain priestesses, sometimes drawn from among the wives and daughters of prominent officials, serving specifically as chantresses, singing and playing instruments such as the sistrum, a small handheld rattle closely associated with the goddess Hathor during particular rituals and offerings. The gentle, rhythmic shake of a sistrum, alongside harps, lyres, and simple wind instruments, would have added a soft musical layer to temple ceremonies, its sound believed to please the gods and help maintain the harmony and order the Egyptians called mad, a concept we will meet again later tonight in a rather different setting. Even in the quiet hours after formal ritual had ended, a stray sistrum left resting against a wall or wrapped carefully for the night carried within it the memory of music that would rise again with the next morning's rites. Tonight, such instruments rest silent in careful storage nearby, waiting patiently as everything else in this temple seems to wait for morning's return. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter of lamplight and incense draws to its quiet close, let the whole hushed shape of the temple settle now in your mind. Tall stone pylons standing dark against the stars, small lamps glowing faintly deep within long, silent hallways, incense smoke still faintly lingering in sealed inner chambers, and somewhere nearby a rattle resting quietly until it is needed again. This was a place built not for constant crowds, but for careful, patient, repeated attention, day following day, evening following evening, century following century, in a rhythm of care that helped define much of Egyptian religious and economic life alike. There is a particular calm in imagining such devoted repetition, the same careful rituals performed gently again and again by generations of priests who believed, with real and settled confidence, that their quiet evening work mattered. Carry this same lamplit hush forward with you now as we step from the temple's sacred stone halls toward a rather different kind of quiet nighttime labor, waiting for us in the next chapter among Egypt's careful, patient scribes. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Somewhere near the temple grounds or within the walls of the village we visited earlier, a scribe sits now by the small, steady light of an oil lamp, a reed pen resting lightly in his hand, a sheet of papyrus or a smooth flake of limestone spread before him, continuing careful work that began, in most cases, hours earlier in the fuller light of day. Scribes occupied one of the most respected and genuinely desirable positions available in ancient Egyptian society, exempt from the harder physical labor required of farmers and laborers, and generally enjoying a level of comfort and prestige reflected in the ancient Egyptian phrase describing the scribal profession as one where a man becomes his own master. Surviving texts meant to encourage boys toward this career often draw pointed, sometimes almost humorous contrasts between the scribe's comfortable, respected life and the harsher daily existence of farmers, soldiers, and other laborers. Tonight we settle in quietly beside this same patient figure, watching careful lines of script accumulate steadily beneath a small, warm circle of lamplight. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. Egyptian writing itself existed in more than one distinct form: hieroglyphs, the elaborate and highly formal pictorial script most familiar to us today, generally reserved for monumental inscriptions on temple walls, tomb decoration, and other formal, lasting purposes, and hieratic, a faster, more flowing cursive form developed specifically for everyday practical writing on papyrus and ostraka. A trained scribe needed genuine fluency in both systems, along with a solid grasp of Egyptian mathematics, since scribes were regularly responsible for calculating grain rations, land measurements, tax assessments, and construction quantities, alongside their purely literary and religious duties. This combination of artistic, linguistic, and mathematical skill made scribal training a genuinely demanding process, one that could take many years to complete properly under the guidance of an experienced instructor. Tonight, the particular flowing hieratic script now filling the page before our quiet scribe moves considerably faster than the careful, formal hieroglyphs carved elsewhere on temple walls nearby, suited perfectly to exactly this kind of quiet, practical, late evening work. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. Scribal training traditionally began in institutions the Egyptians called houses of life, schools typically attached to temples, where young students, drawn mainly from families already connected to scribal, priestly, or official positions, practiced their letters for years under strict and often genuinely demanding instruction. Surviving school texts include copied moral instructions, model letters, and repeated writing exercises, along with occasional surviving complaints from frustrated teachers about students who arrived late or failed to properly complete their assigned work. Physical discipline appears to have been a real and accepted part of this education, reflected in surviving texts that plainly state a boy's ears are on his back, meaning he listens best when beaten, a harsh reflection of educational attitudes quite different from many modern approaches. Despite this harshness, the reward for successful completion was considerable. A stable, respected, and comparatively comfortable career path available to relatively few in ancient Egyptian society. Tonight, our quiet scribe writing by lamplight likely passed through exactly this same demanding early training, many years and many corrected exercises, before finally arriving at this settled, steady evening's work. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. Papyrus itself, the writing material most closely associated with ancient Egypt, was manufactured through a careful and genuinely clever process. Thin strips cut from the pithy interior of the papyrus plant stem laid out in two overlapping perpendicular layers, then pressed and pounded together until natural plant sugars bonded the layers into a single, smooth, remarkably durable sheet. Multiple sheets could be joined edge to form long scrolls, some surviving examples stretching many meters in length, used for everything from religious texts and government records to personal letters and simple household accounts. Papyrus was relatively expensive to produce, however, which is precisely why ostraka, cheap and plentiful flakes of broken pottery or chips of limestone, were so commonly used instead for everyday notes, school exercises, and informal records, reserving true papyrus mainly for more formal or important documents. Tonight, the material spread before our scribe, whether costly papyrus or humble ostracon, carries the same careful, patient ink regardless, each equally capable of holding these quiet evening thoughts safely across the centuries ahead. Nothing more needs to be added to this thought tonight, only the quiet permission to let it rest. Ink used by Egyptian scribes was typically made from two basic colors: a black ink derived from carbon soot mixed with a binding agent such as gum, and a red ink made from ochre, a naturally occurring iron-rich mineral pigment, the red generally reserved for headings, important dates, or particular emphasis within a longer black text. These simple pigments were pressed into small, solid cakes, not unlike a modern paint set, then moistened with a bit of water on a shallow palette whenever the scribe needed to begin writing. A practical, portable system well-suited to work done anywhere from a temple office to a quiet lamplit room at home. Reed pens, cut and trimmed carefully to a fine point, or occasionally thin brushes made from crushed plant fiber, carried this ink onto the papyrus or ostracon surface in quick, practiced strokes built from years of careful repetition. Tonight, a small smudge of red ink marks a heading near the top of our scribe's current page, a simple, practical flash of color against the steady black lines filling in patiently beneath it. This, too, belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Among the many kinds of documents a scribe might produce, personal letters offer some of the warmest and most genuinely human glimpses into ancient Egyptian daily life, filled with ordinary concerns about family health, household business, small disputes, and simple affectionate greetings sent between relatives and friends separated by distance. Many such letters open with formal wishes for the recipient's health and favor with a particular god, followed by more practical matters, requests for goods, updates on household affairs, or gentle scolding over some neglected task or unanswered previous letter. Letters to the dead also survive from this period, written by grieving family members and left at tombs, asking deceased relatives for help or protection, treating the boundary between living and dead as something more permeable and ongoing than a simple final ending. Tonight, somewhere nearby, a similar letter may already be finished and set carefully aside to dry, carrying its small, quiet human concerns toward a friend or relative who will read it, with genuine pleasure, sometime in the days ahead. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Egyptian literature itself flourished across many centuries, producing beloved and widely copied works such as the Tale of Sinu, following a nobleman's dramatic flight and eventual return to Egypt, along with instructional texts, hymns, and love poetry expressing genuinely tender, playful emotion between men and women. These works were copied and recopied by generations of scribes and students, both as genuine literary enjoyment and as valuable practice for developing a smooth, confident hand, meaning that many surviving copies of famous texts come to us specifically through student exercises rather than official formal editions. Poetry in particular often drew warmly on natural imagery familiar from daily life along the Nile, comparing loved ones to blossoming flowers or describing longing in terms of a bird calling across still water. Tonight, somewhere in the same quiet lamplit room, a worn, much-copied fragment of just such a poem may sit tucked among our scribes' other papers. Familiar words already read and enjoyed many times before this particular night's careful copying even began. There is a plain, steady comfort in facts this small and this certain, offered gently, one at a time. Mathematics formed an equally essential part of scribal training, Egyptian scribes working confidently with fractions, basic geometry, and practical calculations needed for surveying farmland, calculating construction materials, and determining fair tax assessments based on the height of the annual Nile flood, a connection we will explore more fully in the chapter just ahead of us tonight. Surviving mathematical papyri, including the well-known Rhind mathematical papyrus, preserve dozens of worked practice problems, some strikingly practical, calculating the volume of a granary or the correct proportions for baking bread, others more abstract exercises meant purely to sharpen a young scribe's growing skill. This mathematical competence made scribes indispensable to nearly every significant undertaking in Egyptian society, from modest household accounts to the vast, coordinated logistics behind building a royal tomb or a great stone temple. Tonight, a small column of careful figures sits near the edge of our scribe's page, quiet evidence of exactly this kind of practical calculation, worked through patiently by lamplight before the more personal writing beside it was even begun. Let your mind rest on this a little longer, unhurried, before we turn softly toward what comes next. Beyond their practical duties, many scribes also held genuine religious responsibilities, since sacred temple texts, funerary spells, and the careful copies of the Book of the Dead that we will discuss more fully in a later chapter, all required exactly this same trained, careful hand to produce and preserve accurately across generations. A scribe working on such sacred material approached the task with particular reverence, understanding that even a small copying error might, in the Egyptian understanding of these matters, meaningfully affect the spell's power or a deceased person's fate in the afterlife. This close connection between writing and religious power gave the scribal profession an added layer of quiet significance beyond its practical usefulness, the written word itself considered to carry a kind of genuine, lasting force. Tonight, whether our scribe is finishing a simple household letter or a more solemn religious text, the same careful, steady attention shapes every line, born from years of training that treated writing itself as something worth doing with real, patient care. It is, in its own quiet way, one more small thread woven gently into this long night's patient fabric. As this chapter of ink and lamplight draws to its close, let the whole quiet scene settle now in your mind. A scribe seated comfortably in a small pool of warm light, papyrus or ostrachan spread before him, reed pen moving in slow, practiced strokes across a page nearly finished for the night. This was a genuinely valued profession, built on years of demanding training, yet rewarded with comfort, respect, and a rare closeness to nearly every important undertaking in Egyptian life, from grain counts to royal correspondence to the sacred texts meant to guide the dead safely onward. There is something quietly soothing in picturing this same patient work continuing gently by lamplight across so many countless evenings, one careful line following another, one thought carried safely forward into permanence long after the small flame beside it has finally been allowed to go out. Carry this same steady, patient rhythm forward with you now as we turn from ink and papyrus toward the wide, dark river itself, and the deep, ancient calendar it has always so faithfully kept. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. The ancient Egyptians divided their entire year into 3 distinct seasons, each tied directly to the behavior of the Nile rather than to the shifting temperatures we might associate with modern seasons. Akhit, the season of the flood, Perit, the season of growth once the floodwaters had receded, and Shemu, the season of harvest and the lowest, driest water levels of the year. This threefold division shaped nearly every aspect of daily life, determining when fields could be planted, when canals needed clearing, when taxes were assessed, and when major festivals were scheduled, all calibrated patiently around the river's own steady, dependable rhythm. Tonight, depending on which part of this cycle our imagined evening happens to rest within, the fields beyond the village might lie submerged beneath calm floodwater, freshly planted with young green shoots, or standing tall and ready for the harvest, each state carrying its own particular mood and its own particular nighttime sounds drifting quietly across the dark, settled valley. There is a quiet, settled comfort in resting for a moment with this thought before we move gently onward. The flood itself, called the inundation, arrived with remarkable, dependable regularity each year, swelling the Nile far beyond its normal banks and spreading a fresh layer of rich, dark silt across the surrounding farmland, the very same fertile soil that gave Egypt its ancient name, the Black Land. This annual flooding resulted from heavy seasonal rains falling far to the south, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, feeding the Blue Nile and its tributaries long before that same swollen water finally arrived. Weeks later, along the Egyptian stretch of the river we are resting beside tonight. Without this dependable annual gift of water and fertile silt, sustained farming across such an otherwise dry landscape would have been simply impossible, making the flood not merely convenient but genuinely foundational to Egyptian civilization's entire existence. Tonight, somewhere along this same riverbank, the current carries within it that same patient cycle, quietly continuing a rhythm that has shaped this valley's whole way of life for as far back as anyone here could ever hope to remember. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. Predicting the flood's arrival and measuring its height mattered enormously, since a flood too low left insufficient water and silt for a good harvest, while a flood too high could damage villages, canals, and stored grain alike. And for this careful measurement, the Egyptians built devices called nilometers, stone structures with marked steps or columns descending into the river at key points such as the island of Elephantine near the southern border. Priests and officials responsible for monitoring these nilometers recorded the water's rising height carefully day by day, information that fed directly into tax assessments for the coming year, since a stronger flood generally meant a more productive harvest and, in turn, a fairer basis for calculating what each region owed the state. These careful measurements represent one of the longest continuous records of environmental observation from the ancient world. Patient data collected year after year by dedicated officials who understood with real clarity exactly how much their whole society depended on getting this one measurement right. Tonight, somewhere south of here, such a nilometer stands quiet in the dark, its carved steps waiting patiently for next season's rising water. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Once the floodwaters had properly receded, farmers moved quickly to take advantage of the freshly deposited silt, plowing and planting fields with wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables during the season called parrot, working with simple wooden plows often pulled by oxen, alongside hand tools such as hoes for smaller or more delicate tasks. Irrigation required constant, careful attention even after the flood itself had passed, water directed through networks of small canals and basins that needed regular clearing and maintenance. A cooperative effort typically organized at the village or regional level, since everyone's harvest depended equally on the system functioning properly. A simple but genuinely clever tool called the shadoof, a long pivoting pole with a weighted counterbalance and a bucket at one end, allowed a single worker to lift water from a canal or the river itself up into higher fields with considerably less effort than carrying it by hand. Tonight, resting quietly beside a nearby canal, just such a shadoof stands still in the dark, its work finished for the day, ready to resume its same patient, rhythmic labor again with tomorrow's early light. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. The Egyptian civil calendar itself, developed to track this same agricultural rhythm alongside religious festivals, divided the year into 12 months of exactly 30 days each, organized into the 3 seasons we have already met, with 5 additional days added at the very end of the year to bring the total to 365, a genuinely sophisticated system for its time. These 5 extra days, called epagomenal days, were considered a special period outside the normal structure of the year, traditionally associated with the birthdays of several major gods including Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus, and often marked with particular festivals and rituals of their own. Because this calendar did not include a leap year adjustment, it gradually drifted out of alignment with the true solar year across the centuries, a slow, patient discrepancy that Egyptian astronomers and priests were well aware of, tracking it alongside a separate, more precise stellar calendar we will meet properly in just a moment. Tonight, whichever particular date this same imagined evening happens to fall upon, that same careful, ancient structure of months and seasons quietly continues, patient and largely unbothered by its own slow drift. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. The star most closely tied to predicting the coming flood was Sirius, known to the ancient Egyptians as Sopdet, whose brief disappearance from the night sky followed after roughly 70 days by its dramatic reappearance just before dawn on the eastern horizon, a moment astronomers call its heliacal rising, arrived with remarkable consistency close to the actual beginning of the annual flood. This dependable stellar signal became the traditional marker for the start of the Egyptian New Year, celebrated with genuine festivity as both a practical agricultural signal and a deeply meaningful religious event, since Sopdet herself was closely associated with the goddess Isis, and by extension, with rebirth and renewal. Priests watching for this particular star's reappearance would have stood on temple rooftops or open platforms in the deep, quiet hours just before sunrise, waiting with practiced patience for that single, dependable point of light to reappear low on the horizon. Tonight, whether or not Sopdet's return falls within this particular evening, that same bright star still traces its familiar path across the sky above us, exactly as faithfully as it always has. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. Shemu, the final season of the Egyptian year, brought the harvest itself, fields turning from green to gold as wheat and barley ripened under the strong, steady sun, cut carefully with simple sickles, and gathered into bundles for threshing, a process that separated the valuable grain from its surrounding husks and stalks. Threshing was often accomplished by driving cattle or donkeys repeatedly over the cut grain spread across a hard-packed floor, their hooves loosening the grain naturally, after which workers tossed the mixture into the air with wide, flat tools, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down to be collected. This was physically demanding seasonal work, requiring most available hands in a farming community. Yet it was also traditionally accompanied by genuine celebration, since a successful harvest meant security and sufficiency for the months ahead. Tonight, if our imagined evening happens to rest within this particular season, the scent of recently cut grain and dry straw would drift faintly on the night air, mingling with the more familiar green smell of the nearby river. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. The lowest water levels of the year arrived toward the end of Shemu, the Nile narrowing considerably from its flooded peak and leaving wide stretches of exposed, cracked mudflat along its banks, a stark seasonal contrast to the wide, generous waters of Akhit months earlier. This drier period required especially careful water management, canals and basins holding whatever reserves had been thoughtfully retained from the earlier flood, and it was during these lower water months that major construction projects, including work on temples and royal tombs, often proceeded most actively, since farming demands eased somewhat and additional labor became more readily available for other important undertakings. The whole yearly cycle, flood giving way to growth, giving way to harvest, and finally to this drier, quieter season before the pattern began faithfully again, gave Egyptian life its steady, dependable underlying rhythm, a structure so consistent across so many centuries that it shaped not only farming but religious festivals, construction schedules, and even the basic Egyptian sense of time itself. Tonight, wherever in this yearly cycle our own evening happens to rest, that same patient, repeating rhythm continues quietly onward beneath it. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. This entire agricultural cycle depended on genuine cooperation across an enormous number of people. Officials coordinating flood measurements and tax assessments, local communities maintaining shared canals and irrigation basins, and farming families working fields that, in many cases, technically belonged to the state, to temples, or to noble landowners rather than to the farmers themselves, who typically paid a substantial portion of their harvest as rent or tax in return for the right to work the land. This system, while placing real demands on ordinary farmers, also provided a measure of stability and support during difficult years, since temple and state granaries served as reserves that could, in principle, help buffer communities against a particularly poor flood or harvest. The whole arrangement reflected a broader Egyptian value the people called mad, meaning truth, balance, and proper order, a concept understood to govern not just individual behavior, but the whole functioning of the cosmos, the flood, the seasons, and society itself, all expected to proceed in their proper, harmonious place. Tonight, that same underlying sense of order rests quietly over the dark, settled fields beyond the village, each element of this ancient system continuing patiently in its accustomed place. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter on the river's own patient time draws to its close, let the whole steady rhythm of flood and growth and harvest settle now in your mind. 3 long seasons following one another with quiet, dependable regularity, marked faithfully by the reappearance of a single bright star, and measured carefully, year after year, on carved stone steps descending into cool river water. This was a civilization built almost entirely around understanding and cooperating with a single great natural cycle, reading its signals carefully, preparing patiently for its changes, and organizing an entire calendar, an entire economy, and a great deal of daily life around its steady, generous rhythm. There is a particular comfort in resting beside a river with a memory this long and this dependable, one that has risen and receded for far longer than any single human life could ever properly measure. Carry this same patient, flowing rhythm forward with you now as we turn from the river itself toward the great stone monuments its steady abundance ultimately helped to build. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Rising now from the flat desert plateau at Giza, 3 great pyramids stand dark and enormous against the star-filled sky, their smooth, sloping sides catching only the faintest hint of starlight along their upper edges, silent witnesses to one of the most remarkable building achievements the ancient world would ever produce. The largest of these, the Great Pyramid built for the pharaoh Khufu during the Old Kingdom, originally stood some 146 meters tall, constructed from over 2 million individual blocks of stone, a scale so enormous that it remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth for well over 3,000 years. Tonight we step gently away from the river and the fertile valley we have spent so much of this evening exploring, moving instead toward this drier, quieter stretch of desert plateau, where an entirely different kind of nighttime stillness settles over stone monuments built to last, quite deliberately, for eternity itself. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. Contrary to a popular but genuinely mistaken old idea, the workers who built these pyramids were not enslaved foreign captives, but rather Egyptian laborers, many of them local farmers who worked on these massive royal projects during the months when Nile floodwaters covered their own fields and farming was temporarily impossible, offering the state a ready and willing seasonal workforce. Archaeological excavations of a genuine workers' village near the Giza Plateau itself have uncovered bakeries, breweries, and simple but decent housing, along with medical evidence showing healed broken bones, suggesting injured workers received real care and were expected to recover and continue their lives rather than being discarded. Skeletal remains from this same worker cemetery show a population reasonably similar in health to other working Egyptians of the period, further supporting the modern understanding that this was organized, valued, paid labor rather than the harsh, forced slavery depicted in some older, less careful accounts. Tonight, near this same quiet plateau, the remains of that ancient worker settlement rest undisturbed in the dark, its bakeries and breweries long fallen silent, their patient story preserved carefully in stone and bone alike for archaeologists to gradually, gently uncover many centuries later. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. These laborers were organized into working teams the Egyptians called gangs, further divided into smaller groups often given proud, informal names discovered inscribed on the stone blocks themselves. Phrases such as Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkora, suggesting a genuine sense of team identity, competition, and even good-humored camaraderie among crews working side by side on this enormous shared undertaking. This kind of organized, competitive team structure likely helped maintain morale and efficiency across what was, by any measure, an extraordinarily demanding and physically difficult multi-year project, breaking an overwhelming task down into smaller, more manageable, and more personally meaningful units of shared effort and pride. Supervisors and overseers, themselves drawn from the ranks of skilled workers rather than distant nobility, coordinated the practical daily work of quarrying, transporting, and precisely placing each individual stone block. Tonight, somewhere out on this quiet plateau, the faint, ghostly memory of exactly such friendly, hard-working rivalry between named crews still lingers gently in the carved marks left patiently behind on stone. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly before the night moves gently on. Quarrying the enormous stone blocks required considerable skill and careful planning. Most of the pyramid's core material coming from local limestone quarries situated conveniently close to the construction site itself, while finer, more decorative limestone for the smooth outer casing, largely stripped away and reused in later centuries, was transported from quarries somewhat further along the Nile. Workers cut these blocks using tools of copper and hard stone, along with wooden wedges soaked in water that gradually expanded to help split rock cleanly along a carefully chosen line. A patient and genuinely effective technique, refined across many generations of practical quarrying experience. Once freed from the surrounding rock, blocks were shaped further with careful, repeated work, before being readied for the considerable challenge of transportation across open desert terrain toward the growing pyramid itself. Tonight, somewhere nearby, a partially quarried block may still sit exactly where its ancient workers left it, an unfinished fragment of stone quietly holding, within its rough edges, the patient physical memory of exactly this kind of careful ancient labor. Nothing more needs to be added to this thought tonight, only the quiet permission to let it rest. Moving these enormous stones from quarry to construction site posed its own considerable challenge, and evidence strongly suggests that workers used wooden sledges dragged across specially prepared surfaces, sometimes wetted with water to reduce friction against the sand, a technique confirmed both by ancient tomb paintings depicting exactly this method and by more recent physical experiments demonstrating its genuine practical effectiveness. Large teams of workers, sometimes numbering in the dozens for a single particularly heavy block, would haul these sledges along prepared tracks, coordinating their pulling with rhythmic chants or calls, much the way many later cultures have organized similarly demanding, coordinated physical labor. For the actual raising of blocks into their final position on the pyramid itself, most researchers believe workers relied on some combination of ramps, whether straight, spiraling, or built directly against the pyramid's own rising face, though the exact details remain a subject of genuinely careful ongoing scholarly discussion. Tonight, the quiet desert plateau holds no trace of sound at all, yet it is worth imagining, gently, the rhythmic calls and steady effort that once filled these same open spaces by the strong light of day. This too belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Precision mattered enormously in this construction. The Great Pyramid's base found by modern surveyors to be leveled to within a remarkably small margin of error across its considerable width, and its sides aligned with genuine accuracy to the 4 true cardinal directions, achievements that required careful astronomical observation alongside considerable mathematical and practical skill. Egyptian builders likely used simple but effective tools, including plumb bobs for establishing true vertical lines and sighting instruments for aligning structures with particular stars, combining patient repeated measurement with the same kind of careful mathematical training scribes received in the House of Life we visited earlier tonight. This combination of astronomical alignment and physical precision reflects a builder's culture that valued exactness not merely for practical construction reasons, but for genuine religious and symbolic ones as well, since a pyramid's alignment with the cardinal directions and certain stars carried real meaning connected to the pharaoh's expected afterlife journey. Tonight, standing quietly at the base of such a monument, that same careful ancient precision remains measurable and real, patient mathematics, quietly embedded into solid stone across countless careful centuries. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. The pyramids themselves served principally as tombs for the pharaoh, intended to protect and support the king's body and spirit through what the Egyptians understood as a genuinely difficult and important transition into the afterlife. Their imposing scale and enduring stone construction, meant to ensure the pharaoh's memory and provisions lasted for as close to eternity as human effort could possibly manage. Internal chambers, corridors, and shafts were arranged with careful symbolic purpose. Some corridors believed by certain researchers to align with particular stars important to the king's expected celestial journey. A topic closely connected to the stars and gods of the night sky we will explore properly in our next chapter together. Surrounding these central pyramids, smaller subsidiary pyramids and extensive tomb complexes housed queens, officials, and other members of the royal court, reflecting the broader Egyptian belief that proper burial and lasting provision mattered deeply for nearly everyone, not solely for the king himself. Tonight, this whole quiet complex of stone rests together in the dark, king and queen and courtier alike settled into their carefully prepared, patient eternal rest beneath these same watching stars. There is a plain, steady comfort in facts this small and this certain, offered gently, one at a time. Building projects on this scale required substantial and carefully organized logistics beyond the stonework itself, feeding, housing, and supplying thousands of workers over years of continuous construction. A task that depended directly on the agricultural surplus and organized grain distribution we explored earlier in our chapter on the river's own patient seasonal rhythm. Bakeries and breweries excavated near the Giza worker settlement produced bread and beer on a genuinely industrial scale, sufficient to feed a workforce whose size at any given time likely numbered in the thousands, particularly swelling during the flood season when farming communities sent additional seasonal labor toward the project. This entire supply chain, from riverside farms delivering grain to careful scribes tracking rations to bakers and brewers, converting that grain into daily sustenance, represents an enormous, coordinated administrative achievement running quietly alongside the more visible achievement of the stone monument itself. Tonight, the same patient chain of grain and bread and careful record-keeping that once sustained this entire project rests, for now, in a settled, temporary stillness, ready to resume its steady work again with the coming of morning light. Let your mind rest on this a little longer, unhurried, before we turn softly toward what comes next. Beyond Giza itself, pyramid building continued and evolved across many centuries of Egyptian history. From the earlier, distinctively stepped pyramid built for the pharaoh Djoser at Saqqara, generally considered the earliest large-scale cut stone building in the world, through later, less successful early attempts including the so-called bent pyramid, whose builders apparently adjusted its angle partway through construction after recognizing structural concerns, all the way to the smooth, iconic form achieved so successfully at Giza itself. This long, patient process of architectural trial, adjustment, and eventual mastery reflects a genuinely practical and adaptive engineering tradition, builders learning steadily from both earlier successes and earlier difficulties across many generations of accumulated experience. Later pharaohs, particularly during the New Kingdom period, largely abandoned pyramid building altogether in favor of hidden rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a shift partly motivated by growing concern over tomb robbery, a subject we will return to more fully in our chapter concerning the journey of the dead. Tonight, both traditions rest quietly nearby, the ancient stepped pyramid and the hidden valley tombs, each representing its own careful chapter in this same long, patient architectural story. It is, in its own quiet way, one more small thread woven gently into this long night's patient fabric. As this chapter beside the Great Pyramids draws to its close, let the whole quiet scale of this achievement settle now in your mind. Teams of proud, named workers hauling stone across patient desert sand. Careful scribes tracking rations of bread and beer, skilled overseers checking each block's precise alignment against the stars themselves. All of it building steadily, year after patient year, toward monuments meant to last for what must have felt to those who built them. Like genuine eternity. There is something deeply settling in imagining such an enormous undertaking built not through cruelty, but through organized, cooperative, genuinely human effort. Farmers and craftsmen and scribes and overseers all working together toward a single shared and carefully understood purpose. Tonight, these same great stone shapes stand quiet and finished above the sleeping desert, their patient work long since completed, resting now exactly as still and settled as everything else across this long, unhurried Egyptian night. Carry this settled, monumental calm forward with you now as we lift our gaze upward, toward the vast night sky and the many gods the Egyptians found waiting patiently among its stars. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. Overhead now, the sky has settled fully into its deepest, most star-filled darkness, and the ancient Egyptians understood this whole vast expanse quite literally as the body of a goddess named Nut, who arched protectively over the earth each night, her star-scattered form stretching from horizon to horizon, swallowing the sun each evening only to give birth to it again each following dawn. This vivid, deeply personal image of the sky appears repeatedly in Egyptian tomb and temple art, Nut often depicted as a great curved woman covered in stars, her fingers and toes touching down at the four cardinal points of the earth, her husband, the earth god Geb, resting patiently below her. Tonight, as we look up into this same star-filled darkness, it is worth resting gently in that old, tender image. The whole night sky understood not as empty, distant space, but as a living, protective, deeply personal presence stretched gently above the sleeping world. There is a quiet, settled comfort in resting for a moment with this thought before we move gently onward. The Egyptians divided the night sky into 36 groups of stars called decans, each one rising above the horizon in turn across the course of the year, and used carefully to mark the passing hours of the night, much the way we might glance at a clock today, a genuinely practical application of astronomical observation to everyday timekeeping. Priests trained in this careful stellar observation could determine roughly which hour of the night had arrived simply by noting which decan currently sat at a particular position in the sky, a skill especially valuable for correctly timing nighttime temple rituals we touched on earlier in our visit to the lamplit halls of the Great Stone Temple. Decanal star charts have survived painted on the ceilings and coffin lids of several tombs, offering us a genuinely direct window into this ancient system of celestial timekeeping. Tonight, somewhere within that same great darkened temple, a watching priest may be tracking exactly this kind of star-based hour, patiently timing the night's remaining rituals against the slow, steady rotation of the sky itself. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. Among the most important stars in this system was Sirius, called Sopdet, whose heliacal rising we already met earlier tonight in connection with the flooding Nile, but whose significance extended well beyond agricultural prediction into the deeper structure of Egyptian religious and calendrical thought. since Sopdit's movements helped anchor the entire decanal system and the broader stellar calendar running alongside the everyday civil calendar. The constellation we know today as Orion held similar deep significance, identified by the Egyptians as Sa, closely associated with the god Osiris, and often depicted moving through the sky in careful proximity to Sopdit, mirroring the mythological relationship between Osiris and his wife Isis, who was closely linked to that same bright star. Tonight, both of these bright, significant points of light continue their same slow, familiar journey across the sky above us, exactly as they have for as long as anyone standing beneath them, ancient or modern, has ever bothered to carefully look up and watch. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. The Egyptians also tracked the movements of the visible planets, referring to them poetically as stars that know no rest, having observed that unlike the so-called fixed stars, these particular points of light wandered steadily against the background sky across weeks and months of careful observation. Certain planets were closely associated with specific gods. The reddish planet we call Mars, sometimes linked to Horus in one of his particular forms, reflecting the broader Egyptian tendency to weave careful astronomical observation directly into their rich and flexible religious imagination. This patient tracking of wandering lights against a backdrop of genuinely fixed stars represents a real and careful scientific achievement. Astronomers and priests working together across many generations to build up an accurate, reliable body of celestial knowledge. Tonight, somewhere along the dark horizon, one of these same wandering lights continues its own slow, patient journey, exactly as steadily and calmly as it has moved through this same sky for as long as careful human eyes have been watching it. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. According to Egyptian religious belief, the sun god Ra did not simply vanish at sunset, but began a genuinely perilous nighttime journey through the underworld, known as the Jewat, traveling aboard his sacred bark through 12 distinct hours of darkness, each one populated by its own particular dangers, guardian spirits, and challenges that had to be properly overcome before dawn could safely arrive. This remarkable nighttime journey is described in detail across several important funerary texts, including the Amjuat, meaning that which is in the underworld, and the later Book of Gates, both commonly painted onto the walls of royal tombs to help guide and support the pharaoh's own soul through a very similar journey after death. The most dangerous moment in this whole nightly voyage involved a great serpent named Apophis, embodiment of chaos itself, who attempted each night to halt Ra's boat and swallow the sun entirely, an ongoing cosmic struggle successfully won night after patient night by Ra and his loyal divine companions. Tonight, somewhere far beneath the earth in Egyptian belief, that same ancient struggle continues quietly onward, exactly as it always has, carrying the promise of morning safely toward us. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. Among the gods believed to accompany and protect Ra through this dangerous nightly passage, the god Set, often remembered primarily for his more troubled mythological role elsewhere, actually appears in these particular underworld texts as a genuinely valuable ally, standing at the prow of the solar bark to help fight off the chaotic serpent Apophis before he could bring the sun's whole journey to a dangerous, permanent halt. This somewhat more complicated, layered portrayal reflects the broader Egyptian tendency to understand their gods not through simple, fixed categories of purely good or purely bad, but through more nuanced, situational roles that could shift depending on the particular myth or context being described. Other protective deities, including the fierce lioness-headed goddess Sekhmet, were similarly called upon in various texts to help defend the vulnerable, vital process of Ra's nightly underworld journey. Tonight, this same layered, cooperative divine defense continues quietly in Egyptian belief, God setting aside simpler categories in favor of the single shared, urgent task of ensuring morning's safe and certain return. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. The 12 hours of Ra's nighttime journey were each associated with particular scenes and challenges described in careful, sometimes genuinely elaborate detail across surviving tomb texts, the boat passing through regions inhabited by both benevolent and hostile spirits, encountering the souls of the blessed dead resting peacefully in fertile fields, and navigating past monstrous guardians whose names and appearances were catalogued with real, careful precision by Egyptian priests and scribes. This detailed cosmic geography served a genuinely practical religious purpose beyond simple storytelling, since a deceased pharaoh, whose soul was expected to make a similar and equally challenging journey, could theoretically use the very same texts, painted carefully onto his own tomb walls, as an actual reference guide, learning in advance exactly which spirits to appease and which dangers to avoid. Tonight, somewhere in the hidden tombs of the nearby Valley of the Kings, painted images of exactly this careful cosmic map rest quietly in total darkness, waiting patiently, according to ancient Egyptian belief, to guide their pharaoh safely through precisely this same nightly passage. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. The moment of dawn itself, when Ra successfully completed his difficult underworld journey and emerged once again at the eastern horizon, was celebrated religiously as a genuine daily rebirth. The sun god sometimes depicted at this triumphant moment in the form of a scarab beetle called Khepri, whose name shares a root with the Egyptian word meaning to come into being or to be created. This scarab imagery drew directly from careful, patient observation of the actual insect itself, which rolls a ball of dung across the ground before laying its eggs safely within it. An image the Egyptians connected poetically to the sun rolling itself steadily across the sky each day and being reborn, quite literally, from that same patient daily motion. Amulets and jewelry shaped like scarab beetles were worn widely throughout Egyptian society, carrying this same hopeful symbolism of renewal, rebirth, and safe daily continuation close against the body. Tonight, that same daily rebirth has not yet arrived, but rests waiting, patiently and dependably, somewhere just beyond the eastern horizon. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. Egyptian priests and astronomers maintained careful, detailed records of celestial events across many centuries, including eclipses, planetary movements, and the steady, patient drift of the stellar calendar against the civil calendar we discussed in our earlier chapter on the river's own seasonal rhythm. A body of careful astronomical knowledge that would later influence and inform astronomical traditions well beyond Egypt's own borders. This patient, careful observation reflected a genuine and sophisticated intellectual tradition, one that combined precise mathematical and observational skill with a rich, flexible religious imagination, treating the night sky simultaneously as an object of careful scientific study and as the living, protective body of a beloved goddess. Tonight, this same sky above us holds both of those understandings equally and gently, Nut's vast, star-covered form arching protectively overhead even as her scattered stars quietly, faithfully mark the passing hours of the night exactly as Egyptian priests once so carefully, patiently observed. Both truths rest easily together in this old, gentle way of seeing, careful measurement and tender myth woven quietly into a single shared understanding of the same dark, familiar sky. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter beneath the stars draws softly to its close, let the whole vast, patient shape of this ancient night sky settle now in your mind, nut arching protectively overhead, her body scattered generously with stars, Sopdet and Sa moving steadily along their familiar paths. And somewhere far below the earth, according to old and tender belief, Ra's sacred bark continuing its slow, careful passage through the 12 patient hours of the underworld toward its certain, dependable dawn. There is a particular comfort in resting beneath a sky understood this way, not as cold or empty, but as warm, personal, and quietly protective, watching gently over every sleeping creature and every sleeping village below it. Tonight, that same watchful sky continues its slow, familiar turning above us, exactly as steadily and as patiently as it always has, carrying us gently toward the next stretch of this long, unhurried night. Carry this settled, star-covered calm forward with you now as we turn our attention toward a rather different, though equally patient, kind of journey, the one the Egyptians believed awaited every soul after death. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. The ancient Egyptians approached death not as a frightening ending, but as a careful, necessary transition into a continued existence, one requiring real preparation, proper ritual, and genuine respect for both the body and the spirit of the person who had died. A whole careful body of belief and practice we now group together under the general term Egyptian funerary tradition. Central to this belief was the idea that a person possessed several distinct spiritual aspects, including the Ka, a kind of life force or double requiring ongoing nourishment even after death, and the Ba, often depicted as a bird with a human head, representing individual personality and capable of moving between the tomb and the wider world. Preserving the physical body mattered enormously within this framework, since the Ka and Ba were both believed to need a recognizable physical form to return to and rest within. Tonight, we turn our attention gently toward this same careful, respectful tradition, approaching it, as the Egyptians themselves generally did, with calm and genuine reverence rather than fear. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. Mummification, the careful process of preserving a body after death, developed and improved across many centuries of Egyptian history, reaching its most refined form during the New Kingdom period, and typically required around 70 days to complete properly, a timeline itself connected to the same 70-day disappearance of the star Sopdet we discussed in our earlier chapter on the night sky. Skilled embalmers, working with genuine care and specialized knowledge passed down through careful training, removed certain internal organs for separate preservation, treated the body with natron, a naturally occurring salt effective at drawing out moisture, and eventually wrapped the carefully dried and treated body in many layers of linen. This entire process was accompanied by prayers, incense, and ritual throughout its many stages, treating the physical preparation of the body as a genuinely sacred undertaking rather than a purely practical or clinical one. Tonight, we hold this same careful tradition gently and respectfully in mind, a quiet, patient craft dedicated entirely to helping a person continue safely into whatever came next. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. The organs removed during mummification, generally the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, were each preserved separately and placed within 4 special containers called canopic jars. their lids traditionally carved in the form of the four sons of Horus. Each son and his corresponding jar assigned protection over one particular organ. The heart, considered by the Egyptians to be the true seat of thought, memory, and moral character rather than the brain, was deliberately left within the body itself, since it would be needed later for a particular and genuinely important judgment we will describe more fully in just a moment. These canopic jars were placed carefully within the tomb alongside the body, protected further by their own set of prayers and protective spells meant to ensure the safety of each organ through the long journey ahead. Tonight, somewhere within a quiet, sealed tomb nearby, such jars rest in careful order exactly as they were left, patient guardians standing watch in the total darkness. Alongside the body they were arranged so carefully to protect. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly, before the night moves gently on. The Book of the Dead, more accurately translated from its original Egyptian title as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, refers not to a single fixed text, but to a genuinely large collection of spells, prayers, and instructions that could be selected from, and copied onto papyrus for burial with the deceased, meant to help guide and protect the soul through the many challenges of its journey into the afterlife. Wealthier individuals could commission longer, more elaborately illustrated versions of this text, sometimes including beautifully painted scenes depicting the very judgment and afterlife destinations described within the accompanying spells. These spells covered an enormously wide range of practical concerns, from proper responses to specific supernatural challenges to more everyday requests, including spells meant to ensure the deceased could still enjoy food, drink, and pleasant company in the world to come. Tonight, somewhere nearby, a carefully copied scroll of exactly such spells rests folded within a sealed tomb, its patient words waiting quietly to offer their intended guidance whenever the soul they were written for might need them. Nothing more needs to be added to this thought tonight, only the quiet permission to let it rest. Perhaps the most significant single moment described within these funerary texts was the weighing of the heart, a solemn judgment ceremony believed to take place in the presence of the god Osiris, ruler of the underworld, during which the deceased person's heart was placed on one side of a great scale, balanced against a single feather representing Mad, that same important concept of truth and cosmic order we met earlier in our chapter on the river's steady seasonal rhythm. If the heart proved lighter than or equal to the feather, indicating a life lived with reasonable honesty and balance, the deceased was welcomed into a pleasant, continuing afterlife. But if the heart weighed heavier, burdened by wrongdoing, it would be devoured by a fearsome composite creature called ambient, resulting in a genuinely final and complete end to that person's existence. The god Anubis, associated closely with both mummification and this careful judgment process, oversaw the weighing itself, while the god Thoth, patron of scribes and writing, stood ready to record the scale's honest result. Tonight, this same solemn, careful ceremony rests quietly within Egyptian belief, a final measure of a whole life weighed gently, fairly, against a single small feather. This too belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. Anubis, generally depicted with the head of a jackal, held a particularly important and closely associated role throughout the entire funerary process. Understood as the god who guided souls safely toward judgment, oversaw the careful practice of mummification itself, and watched protectively over tombs and cemeteries more generally, a role likely connected originally to the real presence of jackals near ancient burial grounds, later transformed thoughtfully into this powerful and deeply respected protective deity. Priests performing mummification rituals sometimes wore ceremonial masks representing Anubis while carrying out particular stages of the embalming process, a practice reflecting the belief that the god himself was genuinely present and actively assisting throughout this careful, sacred work. Anubis appears repeatedly across tomb paintings and funerary papyri, often shown gently attending to the mummy or carefully guiding the deceased by the hand toward the judgment hall of Osiris. Tonight, this same watchful, protective presence rests quietly over sealed tombs throughout the nearby valley, exactly as steadily and faithfully as Egyptian belief always held that he would. Consider it settled now, one more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Osiris himself, ruler of the underworld and judge of the dead, held a genuinely central place within Egyptian religious belief, his own mythology describing a god who was killed and later restored, in a sense, to a new form of continued existence, making him a particularly fitting and comforting figure to preside over the hope of every individual's own continued life after death. His wife, the goddess Isis, played an equally important role within this same mythology, her devoted efforts helping to restore Osiris, connected closely to broader themes of loyalty, protection, and renewal, running throughout Egyptian funerary belief more generally. Temples dedicated to Osiris, particularly at the city of Abydos, became important pilgrimage destinations, and many Egyptians hoped to be buried with at least some connection, however small, to this particular sacred site, believed to be closely associated with the god's own original burial. Tonight, somewhere along the Nile, that same important temple rests quiet and dark, holding within its walls the same old, comforting hope that Osiris offered to every soul who trusted carefully in his continued protection. There is a plain, steady comfort in facts this small and this certain, offered gently, one at a time. Tomb goods buried alongside the deceased reflected genuine, practical concern for a comfortable continued existence in the afterlife, including food, drink, clothing, furniture, and small carved figures called shabtis, meant to magically come to life and perform any labor required of the deceased in the fields of the afterlife, sparing that person from unwanted physical work even after death. Wealthier tombs might include dozens or even hundreds of these small shabti figures, along with genuinely beautiful jewelry, cosmetics, and models of boats, homes, and workshops, all carefully selected to ensure a comfortable and familiar continued existence. Even more modest burials, those belonging to ordinary farmers and craftsmen rather than nobility, typically included at least some small personal items and simple protective amulets, reflecting a belief in proper burial and afterlife preparation that extended, in some more modest form, across nearly every level of Egyptian society. Tonight, within tombs both grand and humble scattered quietly across this same valley, such carefully chosen objects rest patiently in the dark, waiting according to old belief to serve their owners faithfully in whatever continued life lay ahead. Let your mind rest on this a little longer, unhurried, before we turn softly toward what comes next. Tomb robbery posed a genuine and persistent concern throughout Egyptian history, since the very same wealth buried to support a comfortable afterlife made tombs an obvious and tempting target, leading eventually to the New Kingdom practice of concealing royal burials within the hidden, more easily guarded rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings, rather than the more visible pyramids used by earlier dynasties. Surviving legal records describe actual trials of accused tomb robbers, some of them former workers with genuine inside knowledge of tomb locations, offering us a fascinating and rather human glimpse into the real, practical anxieties surrounding this important religious tradition. Despite these very real concerns, the underlying belief in proper burial and careful afterlife preparation remained remarkably consistent and genuinely important across Egyptian society for thousands of years. Families continuing to invest real effort and real resources into ensuring their loved ones received whatever respectful preparation they could reasonably provide. Tonight, hidden tombs throughout the nearby valley rest quietly guarded by careful concealment and by the patient passage of so very many centuries. It is, in its own quiet way, one more small thread woven gently into this long night's patient fabric. As this chapter concerning the journey of the dead draws to its calm close, let the whole careful, respectful shape of this tradition settle gently now in your mind. Bodies prepared with real patience and skill, protective spells copied carefully by trained scribes, canopic jars standing quiet watch, and somewhere within Egyptian belief, a single heart weighed gently and fairly against one small feather representing truth itself. This was never a tradition built from fear, but rather from genuine hope and careful preparation. A whole civilization working patiently, generation after generation, to ensure that death itself might be met with dignity, with proper provision, and with a real and comforting continuation rather than a frightening, final end. There is something quietly settling and resting, even briefly, within a belief system built so thoroughly around care, respect, and hope. Carry this same calm, respectful hush forward with you now as we turn from these quiet tombs back toward the wider world of the living, and toward the palace where Egypt's kings and queens are only now settling in for their own night's rest. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. Somewhere near the heart of a great Egyptian city, a royal palace stands quiet now in the deepening night, its painted courtyards and cool inner rooms holding a very different rhythm of evening from the modest village or the great stone temple we visited earlier, though shaped by many of the same underlying beliefs about order, duty, and the proper unfolding of each careful day. The pharaoh himself held a genuinely unique position within Egyptian society, understood not merely as a political ruler, but as a living link between gods and people, responsible for maintaining that same important balance and order we have returned to gently throughout tonight's long journey. As evening settles over the palace, the pharaoh's official daytime duties, receiving officials, overseeing religious ceremonies, reviewing reports from scribes across the kingdom, gradually give way to quieter, more private evening routines, shared among family, close advisors, and trusted household staff. Tonight, we step gently through these same painted halls, letting the palace's own particular evening hush settle quietly around us. There is a quiet, settled comfort in resting for a moment with this thought before we move gently onward. Among the most remarkable rulers in the whole long span of Egyptian history was Hatshepsut, who reigned as a fully recognized female pharaoh during the New Kingdom period, ruling with considerable skill and stability for roughly 2 decades, and overseeing an ambitious building program, including her strikingly beautiful mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, its terraces built directly into the western cliffs, not far from the Valley of the Kings we visited earlier tonight. Hatshepsut also organized a genuinely significant trading expedition to the distant land of Punt, the same region associated with the frankincense and myrrh we encountered in our earlier chapter on temple ritual, bringing back incense trees, exotic animals, and valuable goods recorded proudly in relief carvings across her temple walls. Her reign is generally considered by modern historians to have been peaceful, prosperous, and genuinely well managed, a real testament to her considerable political skill in navigating and maintaining her unusual position. Tonight, her beautiful temple rests quiet in the moonlight nearby, its terraces holding, even now, the patient memory of her careful and confident rule. Let this small detail rest easily in your mind now, unhurried and complete, before we continue softly on. Centuries later, at the very end of Egypt's long dynastic history, Cleopatra VII ruled as the final active pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek-descended royal line that had governed Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. And remarkably, historical sources suggest she was the first ruler of that entire Greek-speaking dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language properly, alongside several other languages, reflecting her genuine skill in diplomacy and governance. Cleopatra navigated an increasingly difficult political landscape as Roman influence and power grew steadily across the wider Mediterranean world, forming significant political and personal alliances, first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony, in a determined effort to preserve Egypt's independence for as long as she reasonably could. Her eventual death marked the formal end of ancient Egypt's long independent existence as the country was absorbed into the expanding Roman Empire, closing a chapter of civilization that had, by that point, already lasted for well over 2,500 years. Tonight, though her own particular era lies many centuries beyond most of what we have explored so far, her memory rests easily alongside the many other rulers who once called this same palace home. It is a small, patient fact, offered gently, with nothing more required of you than simply to listen. Royal households across nearly every period of Egyptian history were considerably larger and more complex than a single ruling family alone, typically including the pharaoh's principal wife, often called the Great Royal Wife, alongside secondary wives, numerous children, and an extensive staff of officials, servants, and advisors, all working together to maintain the smooth daily functioning of court life. Royal wives and mothers held genuinely significant influence in many periods, participating actively in religious ceremonies, occasionally acting as regent for a young or absent king, and sometimes wielding real, direct political power in their own right, as we already saw quite clearly in the case of Hatshepsut. Royal children, meanwhile, received careful education alongside the children of high officials, learning reading, writing, and the particular skills expected of Egypt's future administrators and priests. Tonight, somewhere within this same quiet palace, such a household is settling gently into its own particular evening routine, children tucked in for the night, advisors finishing final reports, the whole complex, busy machinery of court life slowing gradually toward rest. Nothing here needs to be remembered carefully, only received quietly, the way this whole night is meant to be received. Viziers served as the pharaoh's most senior administrative officials, effectively managing the day-to-day practical governance of the entire kingdom, overseeing tax collection, the judicial system, and major building projects, freeing the pharaoh himself to focus more particularly on religious duties, military matters, and broader questions of state. A vizier's responsibilities were genuinely enormous, and surviving texts describing the ideal qualities of this office emphasize fairness, careful attention to detail, and a genuine willingness to listen patiently to petitioners regardless of their social standing, reflecting real Egyptian ideals about proper, responsible governance. Reports from provincial officials, tax assessments tied closely to the Nile flood measurements we discussed earlier, and judicial disputes all eventually crossed a vizier's busy desk, requiring the same kind of careful scribble record-keeping we explored in an earlier chapter devoted entirely to Egypt's patient scribes. Tonight, somewhere in a quieter side chamber of this same palace, a tired vizier is likely just now setting aside the day's final reports, allowing himself, at last, a well-earned measure of evening rest. Let it settle now, slowly and completely, before we turn our attention to whatever waits gently ahead. Diplomatic correspondence formed an important part of royal governance as well, particularly during the New Kingdom period. when Egypt maintained active political relationships with other major powers across the ancient Near East, preserved for us today most famously through a remarkable collection of clay tablets known as the Amarna letters. Written not in Egyptian but in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language shared across much of the region at that time. These letters covered genuinely practical diplomatic matters, marriage alliances between royal families, requests for gold and other valuable goods, and careful negotiations over territory and military support, offering modern historians a remarkably direct window into the real, practical business of ancient international relations. Royal scribes trained specifically in this foreign cuneiform script would have worked alongside their more traditionally trained counterparts, translating and drafting these important diplomatic messages with the same careful precision applied elsewhere to Egyptian religious and administrative texts. Tonight, somewhere within this same palace's administrative quarters, such careful diplomatic work rests quietly finished for the evening, its patient, practical concerns set gently aside until the following day's business properly resumes. There is nothing urgent in any of this, only the slow, steady unfolding of one more small and gentle truth. Evening entertainment within the royal palace often included music, dance, and genuinely elaborate banquets. Professional musicians playing harps, lutes, and various wind instruments, while trained dancers performed for gathered guests amid the pleasant mingled scent of flowers, particularly blue lotus blossoms, which were closely associated with rebirth and pleasure, and often worn or displayed prominently at exactly this kind of festive evening gathering. Wealthier banquets featured an impressive variety of food and drink, roasted meat, bread, fruit, and wine, along with beer of a somewhat finer quality than the everyday ration beer we encountered earlier in our visit to the workers' village, all served amid genuine, warm hospitality extended generously to invited guests. Such gatherings served an important social and political function beyond simple enjoyment, reinforcing bonds of loyalty and favor between the pharaoh, the royal family, and the officials and nobles whose continued support helped maintain stable, effective governance. Tonight, if such a banquet happens to be underway within this same palace, its warm music and gentle laughter would drift softly through painted courtyards, one more layer of quiet, contented sound settling gradually into the palace's own deepening evening hush. Rest with this a moment longer, unhurried, before the night carries us softly toward its next quiet detail. Royal guards maintained careful watch over the palace throughout the night, a genuinely necessary precaution given the pharaoh's central political and religious importance, standing quiet duty at entrances and along inner corridors while most of the household had already settled into sleep. These guards, often drawn from respected military units, took real pride in their trusted position, and palace security more broadly extended to careful management of who could access the pharaoh's more private quarters. Reflecting the same careful layered structure of restricted access we already noticed in the great stone temple's own innermost sanctuary. Beyond the palace itself, broader royal security depended on a genuinely effective network of officials and informants across the kingdom, ensuring the vizier, and through him, the pharaoh remained reasonably well informed about conditions and concerns in even fairly distant provinces. Tonight, somewhere along these same quiet palace corridors, watchful guards continue their steady, patient duty, standing calm and alert while nearly everyone else within these painted walls has already settled gently into rest. It asks nothing of you now except your calm attention, offered freely, before we drift onward together. The pharaoh's own private evening routine, though naturally less thoroughly documented than his grander public duties, likely included quiet time with family, prayers, or religious observances performed privately within the palace's own dedicated shrine. and simple rest in private chambers considerably grander, though not fundamentally different in basic purpose, from the modest sleeping mats and low beds we encountered earlier in the workers' village. Royal beds recovered by archaeologists, including several genuinely beautiful surviving examples, were often raised on carved legs shaped like the paws of a lion, elevating the sleeper slightly above the floor, partly for comfort and partly, it seems, to help discourage insects and small pests from an easily accessible resting height. Whatever grandeur surrounded a pharaoh's daytime public role, the basic human needs of the evening, rest, quiet, and the simple comfort of family nearby, remained genuinely similar to those shared by nearly everyone else across this same long Egyptian night. Tonight, somewhere within this quiet palace, even Egypt's most powerful living person is, by now, very likely simply and peacefully asleep. Such small, steady facts are exactly what this long night is made of, one gentle thought following another. As this chapter within the palace walls draws softly to its close, let the whole layered shape of Egyptian court life settle now in your mind. Careful viziers finishing patient reports, diplomatic scribes setting aside their careful cuneiform correspondence, musicians and dancers finally quieting after a warm evening's gathering, and watchful guards standing calm, steady duty through the deepening dark. Remarkable individual rulers, Hatshepsut with her beautiful temple carved into western cliffs, Cleopatra navigating her difficult final chapter of Egyptian independence. Each took their own particular turn, steering this same long, patient civilization forward across many centuries of change. Yet beneath all of that grandeur and responsibility, the palace's own quiet evening rhythm settles, in the end, into something genuinely familiar. Family gathered close, duties finally set aside, and rest arriving gently, exactly as it does for every household across this same wide, sleeping valley. Carry this settled, quiet grandeur forward with you now as we turn, at last, toward the very end of our long night together, and the first soft light of morning waiting patiently just beyond the horizon. Hold this gently for a moment, the way the whole evening itself seems content simply to be held. Far out across the eastern horizon now, the deepest hour of the night has finally passed, and the sky begins its first, faint, almost imperceptible shift from true black toward the very earliest hint of a deep, soft blue, the long night's slow turning finally beginning to bend gently back toward morning. Ra's difficult journey through the underworld, described so carefully in the funerary texts we explored a little earlier, approaches at last its 12th and final hour. The great serpent Apophis is once again successfully held back for another night by the sun god's loyal divine companions. Along the riverbank, the first birds are beginning to stir, a single early call rising from the reeds before falling silent again, as though testing whether the coming morning is genuinely ready to arrive. Tonight's long, patient journey through Deir el-Medina and the Great Stone Temple, through scribble ink and flooding river, past towering pyramids and star-filled sky, past careful tombs and a quietly sleeping palace, is drawing now gently toward its own natural close. There is no hurry here at all, only the same patient, unhurried pace this whole night has kept from the start. In the temple we visited earlier this same long night, priests are already beginning to stir from their brief rest, preparing for the important daily ritual of waking and greeting the god at the very start of the new day. A ceremony that mirrored, in its own careful way, the pharaoh's own expected daily duties and the whole broader Egyptian belief in each day as its own small, sacred renewal. The sealed doors of the inner sanctuary, closed so carefully the evening before, will soon be opened again, the god's statue washed, freshly dressed, and offered a new day's first meal, continuing that same patient daily cycle of care we described earlier in our visit to the temple's quiet, lamplit halls. This daily renewal reflected a genuinely deep Egyptian belief that maintaining that same careful balance and order running through nearly every part of tonight's long journey, required real, active, repeated effort rather than simply being assumed to continue automatically on its own. Tonight's final hours find these same careful preparations just quietly beginning, small lamps once again being lit to guide priests gently through temple halls still mostly dark. Let that settle quietly now, one more small piece of this vast, patient evening slipping softly into place. Along the Nile itself, fishermen are beginning to push their small reed boats back out onto the still, gray water. The same boats we noticed resting quietly along the bank at the very start of our long evening together, now readied once again for the coming day's work. The river's surface, still catching only the faintest gray hint of approaching dawn, holds a genuine, particular stillness at this hour, neither fully night nor fully day, a brief, quiet threshold between one long stretch of darkness and the bright, familiar business of ordinary daytime life. Herons and other water birds we heard settling into the reeds so many hours earlier are beginning to stir as well, stepping carefully through the shallows in search of an early meal before the heat and activity of full daylight properly arrive. Tonight's long, patient rhythm of settling darkness is beginning, gently and gradually, to reverse itself, the whole valley preparing quietly to wake. It is enough for now simply to have noticed this calmly, before the night moves gently on. Back in the small village we visited earlier tonight, households are beginning their own quiet morning routines, small cooking fires being coaxed back to life, bread dough perhaps already set the evening before now being shaped for the day's baking, children stirring slowly from sleep on rooftops and in modest bedrooms alike. The workers of this community will soon set out again toward the Valley of the Kings, continuing whatever careful stage of tomb construction or decoration currently occupied their considerable skill, picking up their patient work exactly where the previous day had left it. This same quiet, dependable morning rhythm, repeated across countless similar mornings throughout this community's very long, well-documented history, offered a real and steady comfort of its own, each day beginning gently and familiarly much like the one before it. Tonight's long evening among these same mud-brick homes is giving way now, gradually and gently, to the quiet, familiar business of another ordinary morning. Nothing more needs to be added to this thought tonight, only the quiet permission to let it rest. Out on the desert plateau near the Great Pyramids, the first faint gray light is beginning to catch along their smooth upper edges. The same enormous stone shapes that stood dark and silent against the stars for so much of this long night now beginning to emerge, slowly and gently, from the fading darkness around them. Any workers still actively engaged in ongoing construction or restoration nearby would soon be arriving for the day's labor, continuing that same patient, cooperative effort we explored earlier in our chapter devoted to these remarkable monuments. The quiet worker settlement resting near this same plateau, its bakeries and modest homes so carefully excavated and studied by modern archaeologists, would likewise be stirring gently now, small fires being restarted, the day's first bread beginning its familiar, patient preparation. Tonight's long, settled stillness across this same desert plateau is beginning, gradually and gently, to give way to another day's careful, purposeful activity. This too belongs to the same unhurried rhythm, carrying us gently through the whole of this long night. High overhead, the stars we spent so much of tonight's journey admiring, Nut's vast, star-covered body arching protectively above the sleeping world, Soptit and Sa moving steadily along their familiar paths, are beginning now to fade gently from view, one by one, as the strengthening light of approaching dawn gradually overwhelms their fainter glow. This nightly fading of the stars was itself understood by Egyptian priests as part of the same great daily cycle we explored earlier. The goddess Nut symbolically giving birth to the sun once again, after safely carrying it through her own star-filled body across the long hours of darkness. Soon, the sky's deep blue-black will shift further still, first toward a paler gray, then toward the first genuine hints of color along the eastern horizon, the whole vast night sky preparing gently to step aside for another day's bright, familiar light. Tonight's long, patient journey beneath these same watching stars is drawing, gradually and gently, toward its own quiet, natural completion. Consider it settled now. One more calm, small certainty resting quietly alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. In the hidden tombs of the Valley of the Kings, where painted images of Ra's nighttime underworld journey have rested quietly through this same long night in total darkness, that particular ancient cosmic drama concludes as well, according to careful Egyptian belief, with Ra's sacred bark emerging successfully at the 12th and final hour, chaos once again held safely at bay for another full cycle of night. This same careful, reassuring pattern, danger faced and safely overcome, darkness given way gently to light, order restored once more after its nightly test, echoes quietly through nearly every part of the long Egyptian night we have spent tonight exploring together. There is a particular comfort in this old, patient belief, the deep and settled confidence that morning would indeed arrive, faithfully, as it always had, following exactly the same careful, patient pattern night after night, century after century, for as long as this entire remarkable civilization endured. Tonight's own long journey shares gently in that same old, confident promise. There is a plain, steady comfort in facts this small and this certain, offered gently, one at a time. The palace we visited a little earlier in tonight's journey is beginning its own gentle return to activity as well. Servants moving quietly through painted corridors to prepare the day's first meal, guards finishing their long, patient overnight watch and preparing to hand their careful duty over to the next shift. And somewhere within these same quiet walls, the pharaoh himself likely already stirring, preparing for another day devoted to maintaining that same careful balance of mad we have returned to so gently throughout this long, patient night. Viziers and scribes, too, are likely already gathering their materials, ready to resume the careful administrative work of grain counts, tax assessments, and diplomatic correspondence that keeps this whole remarkable, ancient civilization functioning smoothly day after patient day. Tonight's long, settled quiet within these palace walls is giving way now, gently and gradually, to the same familiar rhythm of purposeful daily activity that has shaped this remarkable court for so very many generations before this particular morning's arrival. Let your mind rest on this a little longer, unhurried, before we turn softly toward what comes next. And so gradually, gently, the whole valley begins to wake together, exactly as it has for as long as this ancient civilization has patiently endured. Fishermen returning to the water, workers setting out toward tomb and temple and pyramid alike, priests opening sealed sanctuary doors to greet their god anew, and somewhere above it all, the sun itself finally beginning to show its first true edge along the eastern horizon, Ra completing his long, careful underworld journey and stepping once again into the bright, familiar world of day. The Nile itself catches this first new light exactly as it caught the last light of the previous evening so many hours ago, gold and rose spreading gently across its calm surface, the same patient, dependable cycle beginning once again precisely where it had paused the night before. Tonight's long, unhurried journey through this ancient valley, through village and temple, through scribes' careful ink and pharaoh's quiet palace, through towering pyramid and star-filled sky, through respectful tomb, and finally toward this same gentle dawn, has carried us now safely all the way through until morning. It is, in its own quiet way, one more small thread woven gently into this long night's patient fabric. As this long night finally gives way to first light, let the whole gentle shape of everything we have visited together settle now. One final time into your tired and peaceful mind, the small mud brick village and its careful families, the great stone temple with its lamps and incense, the patient scribe and his careful ink, the wide, flooding river with its dependable seasons, the towering pyramids built by proud, named crews of ordinary workers. The vast star-filled sky understood as a goddess's own protective body, the respectful, hopeful tradition surrounding death and its careful preparations, and the palace where kings and queens once settled, each night, into exactly the same simple human need for rest that every other creature in this valley shared. This ancient civilization endured for thousands of years by returning faithfully to exactly this same patient rhythm, night following day, flood following season, one careful generation quietly following another. Let that same patient, dependable rhythm carry you now, gently and completely, the rest of the way down into your own well-earned and peaceful sleep. Nothing about this needs solving, only noticing calmly, before the night continues its own slow, steady pace. And so our long night beside the Nile comes quietly to its close. We have walked together through a sleeping village of skilled workers, through a great stone temple lit softly by oil lamps, past a patient scribe riding by his own small steady flame, along a wide river keeping its own ancient, dependable time. We have rested beside towering pyramids built by proud, ordinary hands, looked up together into a sky the Egyptians understood as a protective, star-covered goddess, and held gently, with real respect, their careful hope for what waits beyond this life. We have stepped quietly through a palace settling into rest, and watched, finally, as the first soft light of dawn returned once again, exactly as it always has, exactly as it always will. If you found comfort in this long, unhurried journey through ancient Egypt, consider staying with the sleepy universe for more calm nights like this one still to come. For now, though, there is nothing left to do at all, except to let your own tired mind settle, gently, the rest of the way down and sleep. QC, chapters equals 10 facts equals 100 words equals 20,171.